So thank you all for joining us. We're going to have a roundtable on what is next for Syria, the challenges and opportunities. So we'll start by just, I think, a few notes about sort of Zoom logistics. Since we're all on Zoom, you have two ways of asking questions. You can use the chat box, or you can raise the hand icon if you'd like to speak. And I also want to, I forgot to introduce myself, apologies for that. I'm Ellen Lust. I'm the director and the founder of GLD, the Governance and Local Development Institute. And I want to give you a little bit of a sense of who we are and what we do, and then we'll dive into the more substantive discussion. Okay, so who we are a sort of an institute that aims to promote human welfare by conducting scientifically rigorous research across the globe, as it says. We actually try to answer a fundamental question about why are some communities able to provide secure environments, good education, adequate health care, and other factors that encourage human development while others fail to do so. Those are going to be questions that will motivate the discussion today. We engage with communities across the world. We develop methodological tools, help gather data, undertake analyses on major issues affecting societies today, and then disseminate them not only to academics and relevant policymakers, but also back into the communities in which we work. So as we just mentioned, we sort of undertake several sets of activities, research, of course, data and data support, and we're happy to talk to you at any time about how we might be able to support your own surveys and own work. We provide educational material, which you can find on our website. We help to sort of develop and facilitate a scholarly network and also engage in policy dialogues like the one that we're going to have today. There's a lot of ways in which you can engage. You're welcome to submit and help to read GLD working papers. You can contribute to educational material. You can help to sort of, if you have interesting findings that are relevant coming out, reach out, because we often will accept policy briefs and executive summaries. You can participate in the work in progress workshop series. Also, we again provide data support. If you want to learn more, we feel free and we welcome you to subscribe to our newsletter. So again, visit the website to learn more, and I want to take this opportunity again to thank you and welcome you all, and to dive into the discussion that we have at hand. So Marwa Shalabi,
Yeah.
would you like to introduce the speakers?
Yeah, sure. Also, this is Marwa Shalabi. I'm an assistant professor at UW-Madison. I'm here because I run the roundtables for GLD, and I'm also a scholar, an affiliated scholar with the program. So today I'm just going to be introducing our speakers. I know on our program we had also Dr. Marwa Dawoodi included on the program, but for family emergency, she wouldn't be able to join us today. So, Sarah, can you get the first slide? Yes. So we have our first speaker today, Aziz Hallaj, who is a co-founder and partner and Logarit and consultant on urban planning, development, and local governance. So Aziz is a consultant specializing in urban planning, development, local governance. He is a co-founder and partner and Logarit, where he facilitates various dialogue, research, and policy projects focused on peace building, recovery, development, and governance in the MENA region. His professional research and publications cover institutional, financial, and political aspects of the urban built government, as well as housing, land, and property issues and the war economy. He previously served as the CEO of the Syria Trust for the Development and was a board member of several NGOs, public commissions, and microfinance institutions. In 2007, Mr. Hallaj received the Aga Khan Award for agriculture as a team leader of the Shibam Urban Development Project, and he later served on the master jury and steering committee for the award. Additionally, he was a member of the Syrian Constitutional Committee representing the civil society delegation. So we welcome Aziz, and then we move to Ezra Carmel, who is a director of Proximity International. Is an organization that utilizes innovative research techniques to gather data in fragile environments where reliable information is often hard to come by. In his role, Ezra leads the Innovation Lab and provides technical expertise across a variety of research, monitoring, evaluation projects in Syria. Ezra holds a PhD in political science from the University of Gulf, and his research interests span public policy, local governance, and elections within authoritarian and stability-focused contexts. Also, Ezra hosts a ELG podcast associated with the Middle East Law and Governance Journal, where he engages with contributors to discuss their work and the latest happenings in the region. So welcome Ezra on board. And last but not least, we have our moderator, Professor Erin Lust, who is the founder and the director of GLD, as she mentioned. She recently joined Cornell University as a professor and director of Moody's Center for International Relations. She is the founder and the director of GLT, and a professor, again, as I said, and at Cornell University just recently, congratulations to Ellen. And she's also a senior fellow at the Alternative Policy Solutions at the American University in Cairo. Her research examines the role of social institutions and local authorities in governance, particularly in Southeast Asia and North Africa. She authored numerous books, textbooks, and articles. Her most recent book, a volume co-edited with Kristen Cow, Decentralization, Local Governance, and Inequality of the Middle East and North Africa, that was published with Michigan University Press in January 2025. Welcome to our speakers, and thank you for our participants for joining us. And the floor is Ellen's.
Thank you. The floor is ours, I would say. So again, very, very glad to welcome Aziz and Ezra, and thank you, Marwa, for your work on this as well. Just two quick notes. I should mention this, the Einaudi Center for International Studies, just because I didn't catch that earlier. And that, again, I am very glad also to be at Cornell. So I want to begin, Aziz and Ezra, by opening up the question to you about what you see as the most pressing issues facing the local communities in Syria today. And Aziz, I know that we were just talking, I think both you and Ezra have recently been there, but you've just come back. So perhaps I can ask you to lead off the discussion of what your reflections are about the issues facing Syria's communities.
Thank you, Ellen. I think today the primary mode of understanding Syria is that things are changing very rapidly and unexpectedly. Nobody had an inkling about what's happening about 2 months ago. There was perhaps military preparations in the background, but nobody had actually anticipated that this is going to be such a game changer in such a short time. So all of a sudden you have all of the legacies of the last 13 years on the table, and every issue is begging to be a priority depending on who's presenting it. And naturally, all of these priorities are competing. The bandwidth of the new government is being squeezed in all directions, and they're having to actually respond sometimes in a, let's say, professional way, and sometimes in a haphazard way, if that is the right word to use. But to understand where we are today, we have to understand a bit the legacy of 13 years of conflict in the country. Naturally, there are many millions of people who have been displaced, either inside the country or outside. There's a lot of animosities that were created between communities. This is not just an issue of people versus regime, even though that is the primary narrative in Syria. But a lot of communities turned against each other. There's a lot of ethno-sectarian tensions. There's a lot of personal vendettas at the table. So naturally, the very first reaction that people are having is a bit of a mushrooming of ontological fears. You see that almost in every city. People are reflecting on some of the primary concerns about who's guilty, who's not guilty, who harmed who. There's tons of issues related to transitional justice that have not yet been resolved, and there's no clarity on how they're going to be resolved. There's a lot of issues related to land and property that have not been resolved and will not likely be resolved very easily. So the very first reaction of everybody is to kind of like pull back and feel a little bit concerned about their survival. Naturally, during 13 years of conflict, there are certain realities that were created on the ground. So while Syria is, and everybody proclaims to respect Syria's territorial integrity, Syria was effectively being managed by several de facto powers. And each one of those de facto powers has different modalities of managing the territory, depending on the local context. So we had like 7 large governance models that were being applied, and then you had multiple variations on those things. So almost every town, almost every neighborhood was a variation on a different governance model, if you want. So putting Humpty Dumpty together again is going to be a major challenge, because over 13 years you had different administrative systems that were created, different political economies, different realities. Syria's traditional value chains were disrupted. Syria's traditional social networks have been disrupted. And where we are right now is in the middle of this confusion. Where do we go from here? Now, the positive signs is that people were, on some level, very willing to immediately go and talk to each other. And you've seen a mushrooming of civil society networks, town-to-town discussions, elders to elders, tribe to tribe, you name it. There's now new models of dialogue that were impossible to happen in Syria before. On the other hand, there are certain risks, and I want to address those risks a little bit from a slightly different perspective than looking at the immediate ontological fears. Number one,
something went wrong. Please try again.
On the one hand, right now we are facing the legacy of 13 years of economic deterioration. And you have 90% of the population living under poverty line, of which almost half, if not more than half, are living under abject poverty. And the emergent discourse right now is, of course, related to economic reforms, opening up free markets, investments, etc. But the reality of the matter is that these are going to be quite some time into the future. Whereas right now, eminent needs are for producing 40 million loaves of bread every day, of which the country is capable of only producing 25 million loaves of bread. That rudimentary reality. The issue of producing just enough electricity for people to be able to have the very basic functioning of their businesses or whatever. The notion that you have water scarcity across the country, and the ability to produce and provide water to settlements is a major problem. So the discourse is going in one direction, and the realities on the ground are going in a completely different direction. The big risk here is that the government, in order to control inflation, which is the normal situation after conflict, has resorted to capital controls, blocking the access to accounts in the banks, blocking access to salaries, and this has created a bit of a fake devaluation of the dollar compared to the Syrian pound. So some people are happy with that, but the majority of people are starting to feel an additional squeeze because that has pulled out currency from the market and has squeezed off potential early investments that can create some life-saving livelihoods support to local communities. So what we're witnessing is an attention of the new government on managing the macroeconomics, but there's very little attention being made to the microeconomics. And unfortunately, with 50 to 60% of the population under abject poverty, the trickle down of structural reforms that are being proposed by the new government is almost going to induce inflation that are not tolerable for the lowest and most vulnerable communities. While this is going to create perhaps some economic benefits in the future, the immediate and imminent risks are really problematic. In that line, the new government is looking at receiving a lot of aid, and they have a problem to streamline aid. They want to ensure that they create an open environment like they did in Idlib to accommodate NGOs and donors coming in. But Syria is much bigger than Idlib to coordinate and manage aid. So there is an aid coordination problem that is happening at the moment. And naturally, there is not a very clear vision for how to manage the micro and monetary policies and financial policies in the future. The government in Idlib had relied on a lot of public-private partnerships, which are good for a small-scale economy. Creating those without the proper guards and without proper economic governance can create serious challenges moving forward. And naturally, if you look at how Idlib was managed in the past, a lot of the economic growth that took place in Idlib as a small community took place without careful attention to environmental issues. And the environment in that region is in shambles, like the rest of Syria. And one of the biggest fears is that by continuing a laissez-faire economic open policy, the first victim is going to be the environment. And given that Syria is an agricultural country, given that it's very sensitive to desertification, to water resources, we face a major problem there. On the next level, we have the issue of governance. And the 7 governance models dependent on different modalities for territorial management and territorial systems. And now the new government is wanting to import its territorial system from Idlib to the rest of Syria without proper dialogue and without proper discussion. There's also in Idlib, the governance system partly succeeded because they removed a lot of the layers of governance. So there's virtually no multi-layer governance in Idlib. It's just the Salvation government and large municipalities. You can't run Syria without additional layers of governance, for which the new government has very little appreciation. And as a result, what we're seeing is a lot of haphazard decisions on what happens to staff, what happens to decision-making centers, who's now responsible. Are the municipalities responsible, or is the appointed governor responsible, or is it the director of the district, which was an almost non-existent function in Syria before, and now all of a sudden it's being empowered to take decisions extra to the existing municipal structures. So we have a lot of confusion on that level. And everybody is so focused on the constitution because they're worried about their ontological fears. They want the constitution to discuss citizenship, women's rights, the ethno-sectarian fears on many levels, which are very legitimate fears. But there's very little technical discussions on the constitutional issues that will resolve either the economic management of the country or the local governance issues of the country. So public discourse, international attention was basically trading off with the new government sufficient legitimacy for a number of reforms that certainly matter, but are certainly not enough to create stability in the next period of time. So we have skewed priorities is what I'm trying to do. And the bandwidth of the new government is not directed to stratifying which are the more urgent priorities at this stage. I'll leave it at this and maybe we take it in the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'll look forward to circling back to some of the issues that you've raised here. Ezra, I'd like to start by just inviting you to share your reflections as well.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much, Ellen. And thank you for inviting me to this. I'm really happy to be participating in the discussion and have the opportunity to learn from Aziz and from the other attendees. So I think thinking about the question of issues, Aziz has touched upon a lot of very key points, and I thought maybe I could just build on those a little bit from some of the work that we've done at Proximity. As Marwa mentioned, I work for an organization called Proximity International. We're quite a small firm that works across the Middle East, but really the center of our work is in Syria. And we really mostly focus on monitoring, evaluation, and research. And so since 2014, we've had fairly extensive Syrian research teams working inside the country, particularly in the north and especially in the northeast over the last few years, but also across the rest of the country. And so these teams really help us to collect sort of ongoing atmospheric and perception data. And then, in addition to assessing effectiveness of aid programming and that sort of thing. And I introduced that just to say that just last week, we conducted a 1,100-person survey that I think speaks directly to some of the questions or some of the key issues that I think we're seeing, and I think certainly that Aziz just spoke to. So maybe I could share some of those results. And I think just to mention the survey, it's the second one we've really done since the liberation, since Operation Aggression Deterrence. It's a bigger one that sort of builds upon a smaller one that we did a couple of weeks ago. And we've also done some qualitative alongside it. And I think the findings so far are really quite interesting. I think the most interesting part of it is the level of positivity. Before speaking to the issues, it's worth saying that most of the Syrians living in the newly liberated areas that we spoke with were quite positive about their overall situation, with 90% of them indicating that they think that the country is now moving in a positive direction. But within that positivity, there were certainly a lot of concerns. Some that were shared across different communities, and some that are, of course, much more pronounced in some than others. I think very much in line with what Aziz just said, economy is certainly the most consistent concern across all of the governance. And this is what we saw in our preceding survey in the liberated areas, and also what we saw in surveys that we conducted really before, Operation Aggression Deterrence kicked off, with ongoing concerns around the devaluation of the currency, lack of jobs, expensive productive inputs, lack of market access for outputs. So, it's been an ongoing issue. I think that being said, when we ask people about, positivity, like, are things going to get better? 77% of people that we spoke with were optimistic that the economic situation is sort of heading in a positive direction now. And even 63% thought that, livelihood opportunities were increasing. So that's surprisingly, I thought, optimistic. But when we explored, economic issues through interviews, the informants told us that, they were very cautiously optimistic, feeling that, maybe things were heading in a good way, but recognizing that any positive developments, were certainly dependent on many, many factors, not least of which was the sanctions, which Jolani, of course, has been emphasizing on an ongoing basis. They also noted that despite some of the improvements in the exchange rate over the past few weeks, purchasing power has not really improved, and that, of course, livelihoods, nothing has really changed so far, and they don't expect that to be solved, quickly. In the previous survey, we asked people if they've actually seen, any actual changes in their daily lives so far and what those changes were. And in areas that were previously under the regime, respondents certainly indicated that they're now seeing improvements, especially in terms of access to goods, in terms of prices of goods, quality of goods. But of course, in other areas, and especially like Idlib, for example, respondents were much more cautious about the economic situation because they're seeing, somewhat adverse effects of the liberation because there's rising prices as demand increases into those markets that were previously stronger. Outside of economics, interestingly, security was actually a higher overall concern, but it was very governorate specific. So security concerns were centered in areas with minorities, and it was particularly high in Homs, Tartus, Soweto, and Dera. And it was much lower, for example, in Aleppo. And the responses were similar when we also asked them, do you feel safe in your community? In this survey, we didn't break down, different kinds of security concerns. But the fact that it shows up in places like Aleppo or Damascus probably reflects concerns around other issues like nighttime safety or theft, rather than, for example, like armed conflict in Soweto or reprisal attacks in Alawite communities. We did ask people whether they had experienced, recent crimes such as, harassment or theft in the past few weeks. And certainly these issues were also prevalent, across those areas that were previously under the regime, like even Damascus. So that may account for some of those security concerns. Also on security, we also asked them, if they were happy with how the interim authorities were handling security. And while there were generally high levels of satisfaction across all of the liberated areas, it was much lower, of course, in governorates like Soweto, Latakia, Tartus. And interestingly, in the areas where, there were security concerns, another high-ranking concern was politics. What is the political situation going to be? So, that political process and security, I think, is closely associated with each other. I think then really we saw the next biggest concern was around essential services. And again, very much echoing what Aziz was talking about and reflecting those long-standing challenges that have been clear in, all research over the past few years. In this survey in particular, we asked questions around a few different services. So like water, electricity, health, waste, internet. And across all of these service areas, we saw drastic differences between areas that were under the regime before and the areas that were under, the Salvation government or the interim government. Of course, with respondents in the former regime areas being much less positive about those services. And, much more positive in the HTS and SNA areas. And when we think about how those might compare with SANUS areas, although we didn't include it within this survey, I think they would, from what we've seen in other research, they would be comparable to what we see more in the sort of HTS areas. I think an interesting point that came up in a lot of the qualitative data is that, well, participants were very, realistic about the fact that the Salvation government or HTS has its limits. It didn't really have the resources to be able to manage things, for example, during the earthquake or even now. The fact that they've been able to effectively coordinate some of those issues, especially like the post-earthquake response, seems to have provided a lot of sort of credibility in terms of their administrative capabilities moving forward. Of course, as Aziz says, that's going to be tested now as they try to generalize that Idlib model into other parts of the country. But at least they're sort of riding on a bit of a legitimacy, carpet, as it were, as they head into the other parts of the country. I think across the board in the survey, the respondents seem positive that essential services are going to improve. Although interestingly, when the data was disaggregated by religion and ethnicity, minority groups are much less optimistic. And then I think very much related to essential services, another key concern, or the next biggest concern, and I guess also very closely tied with economics, was housing. This is, a key concern, of course, because, as Aziz was mentioning as well, just the sheer amount of dwellings in Syria that have been destroyed or need different degrees of rehabilitation to be habitable are, it's overwhelming. And closely tied to that is infrastructure. This wasn't really addressed so much in this survey, but certainly within our qualitative research, this comes up continually, especially around roads and transportation. And of course, we're still seeing ongoing attacks on infrastructure, particularly in the Northeast. So I think, thinking about some of the conclusions across all of the survey data, I think we can say that for questions focusing on existing conditions on the ground, such as essential services or the economy, respondents were much more satisfied in areas that were not under the regime. And in line with these newly liberated areas, we're much more positive about, the potential change under the Damascus government, or the new Damascus government. Comparatively, those that were under, the Salvation government and interim governments before felt like maybe their situation wasn't going to change that much because it was already relatively good. But they certainly recognized that, people that were coming from other parts of the country or would start to see bigger improvements. Within the newly liberated areas, there was much lower optimism among religious and ethnic minorities, as I just suggested. And these were especially clear when we asked respondents about whether they were satisfied with the Damascus government in terms of how it was managing security, whether the current trajectory of security was positive, whether they felt safe, whether they felt that they would be treated equally under the judicial system. So those were all, much more reserved within those communities. And then I think in considering the situation overall, it's perhaps worth flagging maybe one thing that didn't really come out of the surveys, but that's really been very present in all of other research, and that's transitional justice, and that really points to that issue of fair treatment within the judicial system. At this point, very little progress has been made in this front, and in the meantime, we're seeing, different groups take retribution into their own hands. And, at this point, I think we can give the Damascus government some benefit of the doubt that these acts are at a scale that's probably too much for them to control. But of course, the new government also doesn't want to seem complicit in any attempts to crack down on it. And of course, it is playing into their interest to an extent. And so it's certainly an issue that is becoming central, I think, in everyone's minds. And I think, in terms of what we've been seeing from our research, those are probably the key issues that we've been seeing so far.
Great, thank you. I want to invite both of you to sort of join me in a discussion, if you will, in terms of thinking through some of these issues, because one of the things that we're talking about and that's come through in both of your presentations has been this question of a kind of the tension of the national level and, kind of central, and then what's going on in the localities, right? And we, as Aziz mentioned, there were 7 different governance models, and of course variations on a theme within each of those. And so in a sense, we've got this real plethora of different ways that governance had happened, right? I think that's, kind of underpinning or underlying some of the kinds of findings that you are sort of reporting, Ezra, as well, in terms of some of these are differences in terms of the, who's located where, right? Where do we have minorities and where don't we? And then others can be differences in terms of, how the conditions had been, right? How positively or how damaged essentially different areas are. And then that's combined with this question of how much do we expect that there's been, a relatively functioning governance system, and how much is the sort of the kind of new central government's interest in forming a system so much different than what has existed. So that's a very long way of saying I would like you to reflect on the extent to which we can say anything about, how those different governance modalities, in the 13 years of civil war, during which both of you have been, deeply engaged in Syria. How are those shaping what responses we have to the central government? How are they shaping the ability of local communities to essentially, kind of make improvements, activate civil society, do things that are outside of central government, but nevertheless are addressing some of the concerns that you've raised? Don't know which of you want to lead off on that. I'm happy either way.
I can start if you'd like, Aziz.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. So yeah, I mean, I think that we've had all of these differences in governance systems, at different subnational levels over the past or throughout the entire conflict. And both, I think, the need to fill vacuums and sort of have kind of de facto decentralization, as well as international support for those efforts, or in lieu of a central government that they are willing or able to support. There's been that centrifugal force that's been sort of pulling the country apart. And I think now we are kind of at a critical juncture where we're seeing that very quickly turn into, a very strong centripetal force that pulling towards Damascus, I think, in a way that surprised me, at least. I think approaching this from the outside and thinking about it maybe through a comparative political perspective, I can't really think of a context where there's been so much sort of post-conflict centralizing force. And I mean, we're really seeing, all of the different areas at this point moving towards the Damascus government. I think even, although Jolene is a bit reserved in his optimism about reaching deal with the SDF so far, I think even it seems like the SDF is getting close to reaching an agreement with the new government and potentially being folded into the government at this point, or into the administration. And that likely reflects that loss of international support and, acute, of course, endogenous community pressure as well. And I'm sure the SDF will try to maintain some of the benefits it's eked out and push for a decentralized system. But there's only so much it can resist, given how strong those forces are at this point. And I think similarly, like over the last few days, we've been seeing a lot more engagement with the Jewish communities in the south and pulling them closer into the Damascus orbit. And so it seems like some of the remaining outliers are starting to be pulled in. But certainly, given that there has been all of these differences for so long, there's going to be all sorts of challenges. I think none of this means that the governance divisions of more than a decade and the regionalism before that will not have consequences. I think first, like, the new authorities will have to grapple with localized, fragmented, weak institutions. And that's going to create administrative difficulties. And I think that reflects a lot of the challenges that we just talked about in terms of the economy and in terms of essential services and being able to respond to those. And so I think, that's going to be highly challenging. And especially, with such a focus on the economy right now, I think it's going to be a key limiting factor in terms of economic recovery. But then, of course, there isn't just, divisions between those different areas in terms of the fact that they were separated and have their own administrative rules and their own economies and their own systems. But they also had very different approaches. Of course, the regime had a much more centralized administration than, for example, the much more decentralized Sanas. And the Salvation government also had a more centralized administration, but provided more, for example, space for engagement with civil society than would have been possible under the regime. And so that creates all sorts of different expectations as the different areas come together. But I think also below the governorate level, we see a lot of differences, right? It's not just, or sorry, not below the governorate level, below the like control area level. Where, you know, some of these differences in governance patterns were highly localized. And so like we saw a large role played by local councils in opposition controlled areas, especially before 2018. There's also been the influence of tribal governance in Northeast Syria, especially like in Deir ez-Zor and Aleppo and Raqqa, you know, where they've assumed key governance roles in the aftermath of the defeat of ISIS, particularly playing key roles in resolving disputes and mediating between community members and the SDF. And maybe while the role of the tribes hasn't really increased in the Northeast, given that they already were quite influential in the pre-conflict period, tribal influence has also become much more pervasive in places like Dara and Sueda, you know, as a result of the dynamics during the conflict. And so that's a new sort of governance dynamic that's entering the picture. And then in these governance also, we are seeing strong armed groups even during the regime control, which created a kind of hybrid, I think, governance system. And as I mentioned, like in some places, civil society was also stronger than in others. So like in Soweto in the Northeast, I think there was also a large role for civil society within the Salvation government, you know, allowing them to engage in things like, you know, as I mentioned earlier, the moment after the earthquake, but it's been much more sort of service focused, I think, in those areas than it has been in the other two, where they've been more sort of advocate roles during the conflict. And then I think also similar dynamics were in Olive Branch or Euphrates Shield under the Syrian interim government, where they've worked through, you know, the remains of the local councils and, you know, allowed this greater space for civil society. And then also maybe in Dara, we've also seen that civil society hasn't been quite as strong, but the communities themselves have come together and played a much stronger role in the absence of sufficient support. And they've also received a lot of support from the diaspora. So that's, you know, created different dynamics there as well. And so I think, you know, these different patterns could significantly impact support for you know, the centralization of control into Damascus. There are concerns about centralization in some communities along the Syrian coast, Alawi areas of Homs, especially in the countryside, and in Soweto and the Kurdish communities, of course, in the Northeast. And I think it's not just about, you know, of course, it will affect how the extent to which they are satisfied or happy with the coming together, but also, you know, their expectations for how they will engage as citizens under a, you know, unified regime, right? Different expectations around democratic processes and being able to have influence in decision making or to have free speech. I think we can also see how some of this was reflected in how optimistic people are about the new administration, and we covered that quite a bit in the survey that we did. So for instance, like when we asked participants how satisfied they were with, you know, how the interim authorities were managing the transition, of the total population, 66% were satisfied. And this reached up to like 90% in Quneitra or 89% in Idlib, even 81% in Aleppo, while it was as low as like 37% in Tartus and 41% in Soweto. And the differences were equally clear in terms of minorities. So like 78% of Muslims across the liberated areas indicated that they were satisfied, and only 40% of non-Muslims did. And we also saw very similar dynamics when we asked people if respondents, when we asked respondents if they were satisfied with how the government was responding to their needs. There was very low levels of satisfaction again in Soweto, Hama, Latakia, Tartus. And again, very low levels among religious and ethnic minorities. And still the same dynamics we saw when we talked about, you know, where is the political situation heading or whether it's heading in a positive direction. Sorry, I've gone on quite a bit there, so I'll let Aziz jump in.
There's a lot there. Aziz, would you like to chime in on this and also sort of, I think, think through it in terms of both the local dynamics as well as obviously we had places where, Turkey played a very key role, where the US played a very key role, where these external actors were also mattering. So if you think through it from the dimensions we've talked about, but also perhaps, considering, those forces, and then of course the changes that the recent transitions both there and with regards to the U.S. within the U.S. are affecting.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it really depends on how you look at the situation. We've been doing surveys of our own over the last 4 or 5 years, looking at different communities and looking at what are the survival mechanisms, so what kind of an ecosystem in which they live. And truly, I don't want to go into the details and the numbers because those can be a bit confusing, but the image that emerges from the previous years is that all of this talk about governance and the government in the different areas being responsible for service provision, in reality is a fake indicator. Even though people do assume that if they have a good service, it's because the de facto power is providing them with some sort of a security to have it. But the variations within the different areas of control and even within the different modalities of governance are so huge. The standard deviations inside each control zone is so big to be able to point to the finger to say the HTS did that or the AAMS did that. Indeed, if anything can be pointed out is that the difference within each area is much bigger than the difference between the areas. Nonetheless, when we cluster the data to understand the ecosystems, we discovered that ultimately communities are surviving by sticking together. It's a form of social capital. Local charities, local business communities are providing support to their neighbors. Tribal elements are coming together, as Ezra had pointed out, to support. In the case of Dar'a, for instance, there was a very high level of satisfaction with the local services, even though they were not, let's say, better than other places. But people felt that because they were engaged in doing them, not NGOs, not anybody else. And there was also remittances coming from expats. There was a higher level of satisfaction with what they had. In general, what we have is a form of social capital that was keeping communities alive. And it's communities, by talking about communities, the clustering comes about to urban regions of sorts. So things that range between 40, 50 square kilometers, a town and its surrounding villages. It's that level of ecosystem that is either making a community survive or not. And these things are dependent very much on local resources. They're very much dependent on expats sending money, way more than donor funding or UN supports. Just to give you an order of magnitude, for communities to survive in Syria, they needed something in the range of about $8 to $10 billion a year to survive. The entire package of aid into Syria, inside Syria, was in the range of about 1.8, 1.9. The rest was being provided by roughly some $5-6 billion of remittances from Syrian expats everywhere, and by local non-monetized social capital. Now, social capital comes with the strings attached because it's not all positive social capital. We've seen mainly the construction of what we call a fence social capital rather than a bridge social capital. So it's a social capital that comes with prejudices, with control, particularly the lives of women were restricted because of these controls, but somehow they also provided some sort of a safety net at the local level. So that's the governance level. Now, of course, when it was announced that Damascus is now liberated, everybody looked to Damascus for solutions. And in a way, they lent some credibility for Damascus because they were expecting solutions from Damascus. Damascus at the moment is not providing solutions, is providing arbitrary fire extinguishing mechanisms. And in many ways, I think it would be interesting if we continue the surveys of people through the weeks moving forward to see how things are operating. The very first reaction of people was to lend the new government a critical mass of legitimacy. As time went by, there's a lot of questioning that's coming by. And it's not just minority groups. In Aleppo, the general feeling of the population there is, yeah, it's Damascus at it again. We're going to be seconded, sidelined, and Damascus is going to take the front line again. So, and Aleppo, for the most part, is a majority population. There are minorities in Aleppo, but Aleppo is a very much city that is not a majority minority city. And you see it very clearly in the city, kind of like feeling that they're going to be sidelined by the center is not an ethno-sectarian issue. It's also a class issue. It's also a regional issue. So the very tendency politically to say, yes, we're going to lend Damascus sufficient legitimacy is perhaps related to wanting to have a government with some stability. Now, as the new government is stepping in and taking too centralized of an approach to whether they're going to deal with NGOs now, in Idlib, they were very keen on collaborating with NGOs and on saying, okay, we're going to give NGOs the right to and the space to provide health services, education services. They come to Damascus and they say, no, we're the state, and now NGOs have to come work under us in the health sector. So the transference of governance models into the center is not happening as per the promise of HTS. It's happening in a reverse order. All of a sudden, they want to now assume the centrality of the state. And that, I'm not sure for the long run how much it's going to last.
I know that we have some people who want to ask questions, but I want to ask you a little bit more about this because I'm fascinated and by the idea that much of in fact, the vast majority of the material support was not coming from donors and from other governments. It was really coming from expats that are others sending money back, and the sort of the ways in which different communities, to a greater or lesser extent, were able to find ways to solve governance problems, right? Everything from security to services. So Aziz, I want to ask you, was that developed in the 13 years of civil war, or was this something that you think of as pre-existing? In other words, did that time, in a sense, help to shape not just these different governance like models that we talked about, but really help to shape also the kind of bonding and bridging capital that you've referred to as well?
I think for most Syrians, they tend to think of the previous Assad regime as a behemoth that controls everything, and that it's a totalitarian system that applies its code everywhere. But when we look at governance indicators on all levels, we see very clearly that the center in Damascus was not applying the same models everywhere. The same code, for instance, local governance code, building code, health code is implemented in Damascus, but then when it goes to Aleppo, it's a different clientelistic network. It's a different corruption network than in other places. So in areas where there's tribal leaders, it was managed using tribal structures. In areas that had merchants, it was managed through different modalities. So national data, if we look through it, was quite diversified. Urban-rural divides were huge. The distribution of developmental indicators across the country were staggering. Naturally, everybody thought we're under the same regime, so we're suffering the same way. Everybody was suffering, but everybody was suffering in a different way. Now, what is emerging at this stage is people are understanding that it's not going to be immediately homogenized. And they're understanding that the new government is somewhat going to be negotiating with communities new modalities of patronage. And so what you're seeing is new aggregation of community voices. For instance, in Idlib itself, tribal elements are already aggregating themselves because they're bracing for how they're going to prevent HTS from taking their voices for granted. So they're going out and creating celebrations for victory and creating celebrations and let's say legitimization mechanisms for the new government. But implicit in those celebrations is that we're a tribe of 50,000 people. You cannot take us for granted. And you see the same mechanisms happening everywhere. People are negotiating now with Damascus. They're telling it, yes, we're willing to give you the benefit of the doubt, but don't take us for granted. You're seeing that among merchants. You're seeing that everybody is right now saying, okay, there's no political parties like in the old days. The notion of political parties has dissolved. So how do we create leverage? And the notion of building leverage, even among civil society, even among merchants, even among industrialists, you name it, tribal elements is emerging now. And we're going to see slowly an emergence of a new political order, not based on liberal mechanisms of representation as much as on traditional mechanisms of representation. The new government, by the way, is not unhappy with that. They're willing to negotiate with traditional community leaderships a lot more than with the liberal political parties.
Fantastic. I have about 50 more questions I could ask both of you, but I also want to make sure that we give people who are online a chance to chime in. So Marwa, I know that you're handling questions. Would you like to help us out?
Yeah, so we have here the first question. I think this question for Aziz, but Ezra, of course, step in if you think there's something important to add. So the question for you, Aziz, you discussed the governing structure in Idlib and the ongoing application of this experience as a whole country. In your experience, is it feasible to create a hybrid system that combines a pre-liberation governance structure and the Idlib experience? Or do you find this impossible for these two structures to coexist?
In principle, we're going to have a hybrid system, but nobody's going to admit it's a hybrid system. What we're going to have is a redesign of the system based on very tough social political realities that have to be negotiated between government and society. But there's an external factor, and Ellen was pointing earlier to the external factors. Nobody on the outside is going to accept a heterogeneous governance system. Whatever local governance modality is likely, particularly that the main influencing partners right now to Syria are Saudi Arabia and Turkey, and possibly also Qatar. And all of them have professed very strong feelings for a more centralized system that would prevent more or less the AANS model to be distributed across Syria. So most likely, and where the negotiations are stuck right now between Damascus and the Northeast, is on homogenizing the governance system. So on the outside of it, on a constitutional and legal framework, I think we're going to eventually end up with a unified governance model. Now, is it going to be the same as the previous one? In a sense, we had smaller municipalities. We had Law 107 that regulated local governance in Syria. Or are we going to have something new that's going to be an open game? In Idlib, they aggregated roughly 155 municipalities into 8 municipal structures. That might not be very bad in the sense that the kind of urban fabrics that have emerged in Idlib are more conurbations than independent municipal structures. But that's not the case in the rest of Syria. So what we might have is the law itself will be the same. How we play with administrative divisions, how we draw administrative boundaries and borders may differ from one place to another. Definitely keeping up 1,300 or a bit more, 1,355 municipal structures on the table is not viable. These municipalities were primarily created by the old regime to control identity structures, but they're very inefficient in terms of delivering services or managing local realities. Are we going to have only 300 or 400 of them? Probably not, but somewhere in between, probably 500 to 600 municipal structures can be expected. A model somewhere between the old regime's Law 107 and the HTS's model might emerge. Though at the moment, I think this is not a discussion that anybody is seriously looking into.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions from our Ghadir. I think so Ghadir was a former research associate in the program. Hello, Ghadir. So the first question was kind of addressed by Aziz already in the first round. So I think the second question is about the extent to which the current political and judicial system is capable of managing the transitional justice process, given all these pressing issues in the country. And Azra, if you would like to let us know a little bit about your thoughts on that, or Aziz, or has some answers for this.
Maybe I
want to
can
take it, Ezra?
go on this one first.
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, please.
Sure. Listen, when we talk transitional justice, people have preconceived ideas about what that is and what it entails. There's been a lot of discussions and models that were brought on the table. And of course, there's one primary concern that is on everybody's mind right now, which is how do we deal with the people who are instigating the kind of crimes that were taking place inside Naya or in other places? Naturally, that is a paramount element of the transitional justice system, but there's also other issues that need to be addressed. For instance, housing, land, and property issues. For instance, issues related to economic deprivation or issues related to discrimination on many levels. Transitional justice is not just about the courts. It's actually about creating a system of fairness. Some of the problems of transitional justice will be addressed by bringing to court perpetrators, but on some other levels, it's going to have to undertake, some incentives for people to accept and to forgive. And these may not necessarily be legal instruments. For instance, given that roughly 1/5 of the housing stock is completely destroyed in Syria or out of function, how do you deal with the transitional justice issues that will have to support people going back to their homes? Especially when their homes to begin with were on informal settlement areas. How do you define that? In many cases, I think what we're going to look at is a mixture of both judicial and administrative solutions. And just to give you an order of quantitative level, in Syria, between the different zones of the country, whether those are Salvation Government, ANS government, etc., there was probably roughly about 2,500 judges in the country. And many of them, I would have to say, are very qualified people, but also many of them are of dubious qualities, either because of corruption or because of qualifications. Some of them were teachers of religious schools in high school before they become judges. Nonetheless, Syria's capacity to aggregate transitional justice solutions, if we're going to depend only on judiciary solutions, is going to face a serious problem, because just for the housing, land, and property issues, if every judge had to review a case one session, hear the commentaries of the different plaintiffs and defenders another session, taking a decision and justifying it a third session, they would need roughly 500 years to deal with HLP issues, not to mention of, how do we deal with the criminality of people who tortured, or people who killed, or people who bombed, etc. What we need before we go into the judicial solutions is a national new narrative. And that national new narrative cannot be left to the judges to do. I think the proposal that there should be a national dialogue process is very important. And that cannot take place in a session or two of meetings of the National Dialogue Committee that everybody's talking about. I think we need to be realistic. A national dialogue process is going to take 2 to 3 years. And it's going to be a painful process of recognizing all of the crimes and all of the painful stories that emerged in Syria. To emerge a new national narrative, it would be a mistake to cook a national dialogue process very quickly, just so that we produce a constitution, half-baked constitution, to satisfy one aspect of the problem, which is the ontological fears of minorities on some level, important as it is, but that is not a reason to speed up the production of a constitution. I'm one of the people who feel a little bit comforted to think that the new authorities is thinking about a 3 to 4 year time frame. The question is, of course, how do we manage it? Is it an inclusive process? Is it a process that different elements will venture into undertaking? Or is it going to be a process led solely by the new government? That will determine the quality of the transitional justice. If we have a good quality dialogue with a vision from the current government that there is going to be a transitional justice process, but without rushing the whole issue and going into arbitrary responses as is happening right now, that's going to be a major challenge. Back to you.
Can I chime in and ask one question here? And this is is tangential but related, which is one of the things that had happened after the 2011 uprisings and then starts of transitions was that people had in their minds that things would change very quickly and it would become Switzerland overnight, right? And I remember talking to a taxi driver, which everybody always says, but in Cairo, and just having these visions of how good things were going to be. Of course, Syria is undergoing a transition much later, right? It's seen what's happened in Libya, it's seen what's happened in in Tunisia, it's seen what's happened in Egypt, etc. So are people patient? So is it not just that the government is setting forth a kind of a longer timeline, but are people sort of expecting and patient in terms of recognizing that positive things may not come as quickly? And yeah, Aziz, maybe start out.
No, if Ezra, you want to take it?
Sure, I can start. I mean, I think given the level of sort of cautious optimism that there is right now, there is a understanding that things will take time, in the sense that there is, we're dealing with this, sort of watershed moment where they're getting away from, 5 decades of a a terrible regime and moving into a new space, and that there is so much optimism about what can happen within that space and what can be built now that there is an opportunity to do that. I think this is the part, that I mentioned at the start, where there's this surprising sort of coming together. I think there is also this, willingness to go through the difficult process that's ahead, and we're seeing, all sorts of, willingness, I think, to pull together for that. I think one thing that I keep coming back to, thinking about the different transitions that we've seen post 2011, and this one being so much later, and maybe learning from those experiences, is there does seem to be this this sort of politics economic trade-off right now, where I think there's a bit of a tension, in a sense, although weak, around like this trade-off between a political system that people want and economics, with the majority of the people sort of aligning with the new government, not only because it's replacing that, that former regime, but also because it seems to be, a viable option for getting to stability, and consequently an improved sort of situation just in people's everyday lives. And that's particularly in terms of the economy and livelihoods, and security, I guess. And so I think there's this sort of smaller minority of people, maybe with stronger voices amongst the diaspora as well, that feel that maybe this new government is not exactly what they want, and are not, as happy sort of following with the process that's being laid out, and maybe have sort of deeper political aspirations of a more democratic and inclusive country, but that there is this sort of greater force pushing towards that just sort of stability that comes with this person that's managed to create this atmosphere right now, and this environment that seems like is going to offer the stability that's been lacking for so long.
I agree quite a lot with what Ezra has put on the table. There's definitely a political economic trade-off that will have to be discussed. The problem is how will the economic incentive come about? With Syria being under sanctions, but more than the sanctions itself, it's the over-compliance with the sanctions that is detrimental. And over-compliance is not just related to the sanction regimes as much as also to the designation of HTS, which is also a big problem, because international banks, international businesses are not likely to be willing to take the risk on being seen working with a designated organization. So removing the designation is one thing, and removing the sanctions is another issue. The sanctions, as we have seen, they're already starting to ease out the sanctions, but that's a minor aspect of the problem. The main problem is, of course, the over-compliance, which is mainly related to the other element, which is the designation. And that cannot be removed without a Security Council resolution, unlike the sanctions, which are imposed by countries illegally, I would have to say. It's the internationally sanctioned as per Security Council 2253 and 2254. These are the issues that would prevent banks and investors from venturing into Syria. As a result, naturally, removing that designation is going to require all five Ps of the Security Council agreeing on removing that designation, including Russia, for that matter. So in a sense, the new government has to consider how to balance the game between, on the one hand, keeping the West happy and Turkey and Saudi Arabia, but also they understand that unless they somehow deal with Russia, that designation is not going anywhere. So there's going to be a problem with legitimacy and a problem with opening the doors for investments because of external factors, and those are not going to go away anytime soon. So what is the way to which you can create that trade-off, economic trade-off, is by a certain number of Arab countries, primarily Saudi Arabia and Qatar, maybe also Kuwait. I doubt the Emirates will put a lot of money into the game, given how reticent the Emiratis are about the whole political Islam thing. And Turkey, naturally. How much resources are they going to push relatively quickly to put on the table? Most likely what we're going to see is some sort of an international umbrella. So the trust fund that has been discussed, the early recovery trust fund, might be expanded. The existing trust funds that already exist in opposition-held areas may be expanded to the rest of Syria. We might see some of those things. And naturally, these trust funds take 2 to 3 years to build up momentum. The government needs roughly $150 million every month to pay salaries. That's not going to be something for trust funds to do. But trust funds can help in that you create bottom-up support systems to alleviate economic pressure on communities, bringing electricity, supporting the return of production, etc. The critical issue to look at the moment is whether the new government is going to receive some of the funds that everybody is hoping that they would receive. And we're talking here in the range of about $6 to $7 billion a year. Are the Qataris and the Saudis willing to advance such a money to the new government, or at least make a deposit of some, let's say, $14 billion into the central bank of Syria? Those are different options of discussions that, quite frankly, will come with strings attached, political strings attached. And I'm not sure we're in such an advanced state of discussions to ensure that these funds will flow at the moment. So we're going to have a very serious problem for the next few months until the political positioning, external, internal, are somehow clarified before we start seeing some serious money flowing into the country. Minding you, this is not reconstruction money. This is stabilization money. Reconstruction money is a completely different package, and we have to discuss it further down the line.
Great. So we have like 5-6 minutes left, and we have a really important question here from our audience about legitimacy. So how can the government kind of lend legitimacy to this current ruler within these 2 or 3 years that Aziz is talking about how it needs time to write a constitution, rebuild these institutions? So how can this ruler kind of maintain legitimacy over this next period of time, especially that other than like just street celebrations and having these foreign dignitaries visit? So is there any plan or any kind of recommendations or thinking about that?
Yeah, I jump first here. I think we need to be very careful when we talk about legitimacy. There is no such thing as perfect legitimacy. There is a critical enough legitimacy. And half of that is international and half of it is local. When the local communities see that there's sufficient international legitimacy, their tendency would be to give and lend some local legitimacy, and vice versa. If the international community sees that the government is receiving sufficient local legitimacy, they will tend to lend. So it's a vicious cycle. The current government paid a lot of attention in the first 2 months to the international side. And I think it's high time for them to now turn to the internal thing. What is needed right now, of course, is the economy. That's one aspect of things. But what is also needed is a serious level of local dialogues. The government is pointing to a national level dialogue. And I think what needs to happen is also a lot of local dialogue. The government needs to go on the local level, start talking to people. And if you just build the national dialogue from the top down, it's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to build the kind of necessary legitimacy, the critical level of legitimacy. If, on the other hand, you combine that from the bottom up with the top down, then you might build sufficient local solutions, sufficient approaches to mitigating local conflicts, local priorities, local service provisions, building up momentum to the national level dialogue. There is no neat solution. And I think if we try to paint things as this is the right answer and that's the wrong answer, we're going to fall into the trap of building fake expectations. The situation is going to be bad for 3 years. If we're lucky, only for 3 years. It's only going to slowly improve. And naturally, it's going to be improving if the Syrians felt that they are being included in the process. In the meanwhile, not everybody will be included, not everybody will be happy, but hopefully a sufficient critical mass of people will be.
And I completely agree with what Aziz just said, and especially sort of thinking at the individual level. I think the same is also true sort of when we're thinking about the kind of meso-organizational level now, where I think a key question still is the extent to which the new government will be inclusive with the different factions that, it's consolidating into itself right now, and, the extent to which it is responding to their interests and, their demands. And I think, so far we're seeing that the Damascus government is, effectively treating its tenure, its governance as, sort of fait accompli, and, presenting the factions more with its own vision for how things are going to look rather than, having a sort of initial dialogue first. And I think given the pressure that there currently is for something different, there's enough pressure on these organizations that they're not really resisting it, but, they will need to start making good on those and, maintaining that support, and already we see some sort of fissures within that. And then I think, on the long term, looking at this multi-year horizon until, a census is done and they get to an election, I think it's just going to come down to like eudaimonic legitimacy. It's just how good are the services and the economy going to get? And I think, when we do surveys or research anywhere else, there's across Syria, I mean, there's always, a very strong correlation between satisfaction with the governance, legitimacy of the government, and it's just how good are essential services at the time. And, as Aziz sort of mentioned earlier, like it's not purely a result of their ability to govern, but, the state of those services, I think, is going to dictate, a great deal of the sort of legitimacy.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you both so much. I'm sitting here realizing that, after 54 years of Assad rule, that we're actually having a discussion about a transition in Syria is amazing in and of itself. And it's also great to have the two of you shedding light on it. We only have just a couple more minutes left. Is there any last words that either of you'd like to share? Aziz, maybe you first.
No, first of all, thanks a lot for putting this together. I think it's important to start that debate, even among international platforms that have a tendency to bring in normative solutions to transitional problems. And I think it's very important for us to remind ourselves that a lot of the things that worked in other transitional countries will not work in Syria. So we need to develop the local knowledge and be patient to understand that there are certain normative ideals that will not be immediately applicable in Syria. Creating that kind of an understanding and space is very vital rather than creating pressure on the new authorities and on the situation in general at the moment.
Okay. Thank you. And Ezra.
I think mostly I'd just like to thank you for allowing me to participate in this forum and to get to hear Aziz and to participate in the discussion. So I think nothing else from my side.
Great. Great. Thank you. Thank you again, both. Thank you, Marwa, for organizing this, and Sarah for keeping us on track, and for all of the participants who joined us today. Have a great day.